of Elisha, a prophet whose name echoes through Scripture, yet whose full legacy has been preserved in a place many never expect: Ethiopia. Here, in the sacred halls of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, his life and works are remembered not only for the well-known miracles of the canonical Bible, but for acts that Western readers rarely encounter, acts that have been passed down through centuries of oral tradition, hidden manuscripts, and devoted preservation. What if a prophet could touch the lives of ordinary people in ways that seemed impossible? What if a barren woman could receive the gift of a child, a widow's small supply of oil could multiply to sustain her family, or a sick man could be healed in ways that defied understanding? These were not just spectacular events. They were signs of a divine presence quietly shaping the lives of individuals and entire communities. And yet, beyond these familiar stories lies a shadowed world of miracles, moments preserved in Ethiopian tradition where Elisha's actions were remembered not only as divine interventions but as a living connection between God and humanity. Ethiopia's Orthodox Church holds one of the oldest Christian canons in the world, containing 88 books that go beyond the familiar Western Bible. Within these texts lie stories and insights that deepen our understanding of prophets like Elisha, illuminating hidden miracles and spiritual truths that often go unnoticed. The Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopian manuscripts, adds another layer, revealing celestial visions, divine battles, and mysteries that intersect with the prophet's own story. Together, these sources invite us to step beyond the boundaries of what is commonly known, offering a glimpse into a spiritual universe where miracles are not anomalies, but signs of God's ongoing presence in the world. Walking through the corridors of ancient Ethiopian monasteries, one can almost feel the quiet weight of history pressing from the pages of handwritten manuscripts. Here, stories of Elisha are more than records. They are living traditions recited, remembered, and honored through generations. Imagine the awe of a community witnessing a miracle, a child restored to life, a village saved from famine, a healer whose touch brings hope. These stories, some of which have never been seen outside Ethiopia, carry the essence of faith intertwined with culture, a testimony to the human need to see the divine in action, and a record of a prophet whose reach extended far beyond what Western scripture alone reveals. Elisha's miracles were always relational, grounded in the real lives of people who were suffering, hoping, or seeking guidance. Each story, whether it involved healing, provision, or protection, was not simply a display of supernatural power. It was a message that God was present in every detail of human life. And within Ethiopian tradition, there is a richness and depth to these narratives that transforms them from history lessons into living, breathing experiences. These lost miracles offer not just wonder, but an intimate look at how faith shaped societies, guided communities, and inspired generations. Now, as a viewer, your presence here is more than passive observation. You are part of this journey into forgotten history and sacred wisdom. You have the power to keep these stories alive. Support us by subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and sharing it with friends, helping us reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers so we can continue to uncover deep knowledge and hidden truths. Consider sending a super thanks, which allows us to research even further and bring the most profound stories to you. We also want to hear from you. Comment your name and the city you are watching from. And if you want to explore the sources yourself, links to the 88 Books Ethiopian Bible and the Book of Enoch 1, 2, 3 in English are in the description below. Elisha's life starts in the quiet hills of Israel, when the country was full of political unrest and spiritual longing. He came from a time when prophets were more than just advisors to kings. They were voices that spoke with the authority of God and often stood between the people and the results of their actions. Elisha's story cannot be told without mentioning Elijah, his mentor. When Elijah left the earth in a dramatic way, it left a big hole but also a clear sense of responsibility. When Elijah threw his cloak over Elisha, it was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a transfer of power, a divine calling that would change the course of Israelite history. Elisha quickly and firmly accepted this mantle. He left behind his plowed fields and family to start a new life that required unwavering faith and the courage to face forces that are beyond the understanding of most people. Elisha entered a world of kings and kingdoms, where the choices of leaders could mean life or death for whole communities. People like him who were prophets didn't have the luxury of quiet study. Their lives were deeply involved in politics, war, and social problems. But even though these duties are heavy, Elisha is known for being humble and easy to talk to. He didn't want fame or recognition. People didn't come to him for power. They came to him for help, healing, and hope when regular solutions had failed. This human side of the prophet makes his story still relevant today. He was a man who faced the impossible but was still connected to the people he served in a close, almost family-like way. There is a lot of evidence for Elisha's miracles in the Bible, and they show both God's power and how deeply they affected people. When Elijah hit the Jordan's waters with his cloak, it wasn't just a show of supernatural power. It was a sign that life was returning to the land and its people. Elisha later did similar things that connected the natural and the miraculous. He made loaves of bread that could feed hundreds, turned bad food into safe food, and healed the sick. These were not just showy acts. They were important for the survival of communities. The healing of Naaman, the Syrian commander who had leprosy, shows both the prophet's divine authority and his insistence on humility and obedience. Naaman, a person of importance and pride, had to face his own doubts and ego. He learned that simple acts of faith can lead to extraordinary things. Elisha's insistence on following God's orders, even when they didn't make sense or seemed unimportant, shows that he was a leader who was based on trust, not personal ambition. Elisha's story is just as much about struggle as it is about miracles. Living as a prophet in ancient Israel was not always easy. He was always under a lot of stress because he had to deal with a complicated political situation and see violence, famine, and hopelessness. He often did miracles to help people in need, not just to show off his power. He was called to help during times of spiritual and material crisis. Sometimes he had to negotiate with kings, and other times he had to comfort the most vulnerable people. Every miracle had its own dangers and needed bravery, good judgment, and moral clarity. His sleepless nights, prayers, conversations with God, and thoughts on justice show that he was a prophet who cared deeply about the people he served, but he was always aware of the divine side of everything he did. His connections with the people around him show even more of the human side of his journey. Elisha taught his followers, led groups, and often acted as a go-between for God and people who needed help. He was an authoritative figure who was also easy to talk to. He earned respect and loyalty through his understanding and empathy. He showed patience and a careful awareness of people's feelings even when things were very tense or in a crisis. The story of the Shunammite woman, whose child was brought back to life, is a good example of how God can help people and show compassion at the same time. He didn't just do the miracle and leave. He talked to the family, understood their grief, and helped them through a process that strengthened both their faith and their humanity. Elisha's miracles often had larger social and political effects as well. When he cursed the young people who made fun of him in Bethel, and the effects were immediate, It was not only a way for him to protect himself, but also a lesson for society about respect, faith, and the importance of divine calling. His actions were a reminder that spiritual authority had effects on the world, and that divine actions often had an effect on social order, morality, and community life. Even though his actions seemed harsh, they were carefully thought out ways to get people to act in line with higher values. Going beyond the usual stories, you can see in Elisha a prophet whose life was full of normal problems and huge responsibilities. He didn't come from a famous or wealthy family. His calling required bravery, sacrifice, and a close relationship with God that guided all of his choices. His story resonates because it reflects the human experience, times of doubt, struggle, and perseverance mixed with times of insight, kindness, and great success. Following Elisha's journey gives us a glimpse of how divine authority and human experience interact, and how one person's life can affect many others when it is in line with a higher purpose, changing culture, belief, and history. Elisha's story still has a strong but subtle message about faith-based leadership. His life teaches us that real power isn't about being in charge or getting praise. It's about serving others, being honest, and being brave when things are uncertain. The choices he made, the risks he took, and the kindness he showed to others show how complicated life is and how important it is to be spiritually responsible. The miracles may get people's attention, but his constant presence, moral courage, and empathy are what really stick with them. Ethiopian tradition makes these parts of Elisha's personality bigger and keeps them alive. Stories that have been passed down through the years talk about not only the miracles but also how people reacted, how the community was affected, and the moral and spiritual lessons that can be learned from each act. Elisha is not only a character from the Bible, he is also a symbol of strength, obedience, and the possibility of working together with God. This shows that great things can come from deeply engaging with the everyday things in life. When you open the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, you can tell right away that it's not just a translation of familiar scripture. The 88 books tell a story that is much more complex and rich than the Western canon. They have many layers of meaning that show how people have been devoted to, explored, and shared their culture and spirituality for centuries. The differences are not small. They change how people see prophets like Elisha and the miracles that are said to have happened to them. The Western Bible may shorten stories or not record some events, but the Ethiopian canon keeps a wide view, going into great detail about miracles, visions, and the lives of holy men and women. This shows how deeply faith runs in a society that has kept these traditions alive despite outside pressures and years of being cut off from the rest of the world. The canon has books that aren't in most Western Bibles, like Jubilees, 1 Enoch, and the Book of the Covenant. Each of these books gives context, backstory, or insight that makes prophetic action easier to understand. These texts do more than just repeat what is in well-known scripture. They go into more detail by giving explanations, adding dialogue, and describing miraculous events that the Western tradition either leaves out or doesn't go into enough detail about. For example, the canonical text talks about Elisha's healing and providing, but the Ethiopian Bible often goes into more detail about these events, showing how they affected whole communities socially, spiritually, and morally. These additions reveal the distinctive perspective of Ethiopian Christianity on divine intervention, emphasizing human experience, relational faith, and the interconnectedness of earthly and spiritual existence. This point of view is based on oral tradition. Long before manuscripts were written or codified, Ethiopian elders and monks kept the stories of prophets alive by carefully reciting them. They taught each new generation to hear, remember, and live by the lessons in these stories. This oral transmission isn't just a way to tell stories. It's a strict way to protect knowledge so that moral lessons, spiritual insights, and other details stay the same. When these stories were finally written down on parchment, they had the rhythm, feeling, and depth of meaning that had been passed down through generations of spoken word. The Ethiopian Canon is more than just a book. It is the crystallization of a living culture that values memory, community, and the human side of the divine. The mystical elements of the Ethiopian Canon distinctly differentiate it from Western scripture. Prophets are not simply depicted as historical figures or divine messengers. They serve as intermediaries whose experiences frequently traverse the boundary between the material and spiritual realms. Their visions, spiritual struggles, and miracles are described in vivid, sometimes strange ways, which makes it seem like the divine realm is not far away or abstract, but rather a part of everyday life. In this case, Elisha is more than just a prophet who does separate miracles. He becomes a person whose life is connected to heavenly hierarchies, whose actions have an impact on people outside of his own community, and whose obedience and bravery are both spiritual tools and historical events. Every story keeps a sense of wonder, a respect for the unseen, and an understanding that faith is not just something you do in rituals, but also something you do in all parts of your life by interacting with God's living power. This canon also shows the larger historical and cultural realities of Ethiopia, a country that has long seen itself as a keeper of ancient knowledge. Ethiopia's religious texts have stayed the same over time, unlike in other places where they were often destroyed, changed, or censored. The Ethiopian Church's dedication to maintaining both written and oral traditions enabled stories such as Elisha's lost miracles to endure, frequently with greater detail than in Western narratives. These texts show social structures, moral values, and community values that are just as important as the spiritual lessons they teach. They are not just records of the past. They are living guides to understanding faith, duty, and how divine action affects human society. Another interesting thing about the Ethiopian Canon is how it shows the relationship between human and divine action. Miracles are not usually just one-time shows of supernatural power. They are often very relational, showing how God helps people who are in need, obeys, or even makes mistakes. This method stresses the moral and ethical parts of prophetic work. For example, Elisha's healing of Naaman is not just a story about curing a disease. It is also a story about humility, faith, and change, told in a way that shows how important it is to learn, obey, and recognize God's authority. The Ethiopian texts add more dialogue, personal reflection, and social context to these stories, giving us a better idea of how miracles changed the lives of real people, real communities, and the country's ongoing spiritual life. Mystical elements enhance this viewpoint. Many times, prophets are shown as people who are part of a cosmic game, interacting with spiritual forces that both threaten and guide human life. Angels, spirits, and divine signs coexist with human actions, establishing a realm where faith is dynamic, immediate, and deeply intertwined with reality. Ethiopian manuscripts preserve these elements with a vividness rarely found in Western texts, and their survival through centuries of oral and written tradition underscores the value placed on spiritual awareness, moral integrity, and devotion. So, the canon isn't just a book of rules. It's an invitation to interact with the sacred in a way that is creative, active, and very human. The Ethiopian Orthodox Canon changes how we think about prophecy in a lot of ways. Instead of showing prophets as far-off people who do amazing things on their own, it puts them in the context of everyday life, including political struggles, social responsibilities, personal doubts, and community problems. The way this story shows Elisha's journey is connected to the lives of the people around him. This shows how God's will and human choice are always at odds with each other. This point of view makes you really appreciate how complicated faith is, how hard it is to be a leader, and how a life dedicated to spiritual service can have a lasting impact. The Ethiopian Canon's depth, along with its oral traditions and mystical interpretations, gives us a new way to think about Elisha's lost miracles. Each story, carefully kept and passed down, lets us feel like we are living the prophet's life in a real way. Miracles are not events that happened a long time ago. They are experiences that change communities, affect choices, and show how the earthly and the divine interact. Reading these texts gives you a better understanding of both the life of a prophet and a culture that has long valued the preservation of knowledge, the depth of faith, and the deep connection between God and people. The stories of Elisha's miracles in the Bible are full of moments that grab your attention, not just because they are supernatural, but also because of the human experiences that surround them. Picture yourself standing on the banks of the Jordan River, where the water is high and wild, separating everyday life from a new chapter of divine intervention. Passing Elijah's cloak to Elisha was more than just a symbolic gesture. It was a way for Elisha to enter a world where faith required action. Elisha's first big miracle happened when he hit the waters of the Jordan with his staff, and they parted so that he and the people following him could cross on dry ground. Think about how tense that moment was. The rushing water, the disbelief on the faces of people watching, and the sudden, awe-filled realization that divine power was there and then. In this world, miracles happen to regular people all the time, changing how they thought about faith and what was possible. The prophet's powers went beyond the Jordan River and into the personal, often desperate parts of life. Think about the Shunammite woman's son, who died too soon and caused so much sadness that it seemed to affect everyone in the house. Elisha's answer was calm but full of tension. He moved through the rooms with a quiet authority that made people pay attention. He prayed, lay down on top of the boy, and brought life back to a body that had already given up. Think about how tense it was in that room. The stillness, the tears frozen on cheeks, and the heartbeat of hope shaking in every corner. Then, the miraculous moment of resurrection. It wasn't just a display of divine power. It was a movie about tension, patience, and the thin line between life and death. In these miracles, the audience feels every heartbeat, gasp, and quiet whisper of disbelief as they watch the impossible happen. Elisha's miracles also often included providing for people when they were running low on supplies. A widow's household was about to lose everything to creditors, but her small amount of oil grew in a way that was hard to understand. Imagine the room, simple and dimly lit, with the widow pouring vessel after vessel into empty jars that were overflowing with a quiet, miraculous abundance. Each drop that filled a jar showed faith, obedience, and divine care. The story's tension doesn't just come from danger, it also comes from the hope that the miraculous provision will work and hope will be restored. Elisha's actions have a cinematic quality because they show how ordinary lives can come into contact with the extraordinary and how every moment is full of suspense and moral weight. Elisha's miracles had both show and human vulnerability in the area of healing. The story of Naaman, a Syrian commander with leprosy, has many levels of social and emotional tension. Naaman comes to Israel with money, status, and a lot of pride, expecting to see a big show of power. Elisha tells him instead to dip 7 times in the Jordan. You can almost see Naaman's hesitation, the doubt in his eyes, and the fight inside him between doubt and obedience. And then, as he follows the order, the scales of disease fall off, and he becomes a new person. The subtle tension in this story is like a movie, the internal drama of pride facing faith, the quiet suspense of action that seems too easy to work, and the final, visually striking moment of restoration. It is a miracle that touches people not only because of what happens, but also because of how it is told, where human emotion and divine action are one and the same. Food miracles also show how suspense, human need, and divine provision can all work together. It wasn't just a calculation of how much food Elisha gave to 100 men with only 20 loaves of barley bread. It was also a test of faith. Picture the crowd, hungry and nervous, watching as the prophet hands out the loaves. Every hand is outstretched and every mouth is waiting, creating a visual beat of tension until the miraculous multiplication satisfies everyone. Here, the movie-like part is the way that expectation, human desire, and divine intervention all work together, making everyone feel the tension as it happens. These actions are not just about getting food. They show that faith and obedience can bring abundance even when things are bad. Elisha's miracles almost never happened on their own. Witnesses were often involved, and their own reactions were part of the story. Others saw the Jordan River split, a child come back to life, or Naaman get better. Each person saw the miracle in a different way, and their awe, doubt, or fear added to the story. You can picture the villagers, soldiers, or family members standing at a distance, unsure of what to do, and then seeing the moment when the divine breaks into everyday life. In movie terms, this is the tension of perspective, the close-ups of eyes widening in disbelief, the quiet whispers, the palpable energy of anticipation, and the final release of astonishment as miracles happen. Elisha's miracles have a rhythm and timing that are similar to a well-directed scene, even though the biblical stories are short. Every moment builds up to a climax, like when hands reach into the water, when the Jordan is dipped, when oil is poured, or when bread is broken. But there are also times when people doubt, hesitate, and have complicated relationships. The prophet himself feels the weight of his responsibilities. He deals with people's fears, doubts, and practical needs while always keeping his mind on what God wants him to do. His actions require both bravery and patience, and the miracles are just as much about his relationship with God as they are about the results for the people he helps. Every act has a mix of suspense, visual storytelling, and human emotion. The splitting of the Jordan, the resurrection, the giving of oil, the feeding of the crowd, and the healing of Naaman are all stories that make the miraculous feel real. They aren't just shows of power, they're real-life experiences with high stakes, tension, and dramatic release. People are fascinated by Elisha's miracles because they are based on everyday things but are made better by the divine. They let people, whether they lived a long time ago or now, feel the tension, the hope, and the emotional power of faith in action. Even when you read these stories quietly today, it's easy to picture the sights, sounds, and feelings of those times. The rushing waters, the worried crowd, the quiet room of grief, the pouring jars of oil, and the hesitant commander, and see why these miracles have lasted in people's minds and been passed down through the years. They do more than just make you feel awe. They give you a way to think about how God's actions, people's faith, and the unpredictable drama of life all come together. In these canonical miracles, the prophet comes to life not only through the acts themselves, but also through the human experiences, emotional depth, and cinematic tension that surround them. The stories of Elisha's miracles live on in the spoken word in the remote highlands of Ethiopia, where mist curls over rough cliffs and old monasteries cling to mountainsides. These oral traditions have a life that written texts sometimes don't, keeping not only the events but also the feelings, tensions, and awe that went along with them. Elders tell stories about the prophet in a way that makes people feel both wonder and connection, showing how divine actions changed the lives of regular people. Elisha is not just a distant figure doing amazing things in these stories. He is a real presence in communities, guiding, comforting, and changing people through actions that have a lasting effect. Ethiopian monasteries have kept these hidden miracles safe, protecting not only the texts but also the memories and interpretations of many generations. In addition to the illuminated manuscripts, there are also the quiet voices of monks telling stories of miracles that aren't found in the Western Bible. These stories include small but powerful miracles, like healing illnesses in the middle of the night, making barren fields fertile after prayer, and providing invisible protection during raids or conflict. Every story is full of suspense and how people react, showing how fear, hope, and the presence of God come together. The emotional weight of these miracles is most strongly felt when they are told through gesture, tone, and group participation. What makes these oral traditions stand out is how much they care about the details of people's lives. In one story, a village that was starving remembers how Elisha's blessing made their small harvest bigger. This didn't happen through some kind of divine power, but through a series of instructions, acts of obedience, and collective faith that involved everyone in the village. Men, women, and children all took part, following simple but holy steps. Each person added to the miracle as much as the prophet did. The focus on community involvement makes the miracle more human and emotional. It's not just something that people see alone. It's something that brings people together and changes them, giving them hope and strength in the face of adversity. Ethiopian folklore contains other stories that show miracles that Western texts don't mention at all. These stories give us a glimpse of how the prophet affected everyday life. People say that Elisha stepped in to settle fights, stop accidents, or help travelers safely cross dangerous ground. These are all examples of quiet, understated power. People who saw these miracles thought they were very important, even though they weren't as dramatic as a river splitting or a child coming back to life. They talk about how people in their cultures see the sacred as being closely linked to everyday life, where divine action is not always flashy but is always important and always connected to human need. When you hear these stories, you start to understand a prophet whose influence goes far beyond the events that are written down in the Bible. This prophet is a part of community and survival. Ethiopian elders frequently discuss miracles, highlighting both individual and communal transformation. Healing is seldom portrayed as an isolated event. It extends outward, influencing families, communities, and even the ethical awareness of entire regions. When a sick child got better, the story might talk about how the child got better, how the parents felt hopeful again, how the neighbors felt relieved, and how the whole village felt reverent awe. In the same way, the stories show how these interventions built trust, solidarity, and a strong sense of God's presence when supplies increased or threats were miraculously avoided. In these retellings, the miracle and its social and emotional effects are always linked. This shows the human side of prophecy that is often missed in written records. Because these traditions are passed down orally, the stories can be very dynamic, almost like movies. Monks and elders use gestures, pauses, and changes in tone to build suspense and make people want to know what will happen next. Listeners can feel the tension when a community is facing disease or famine, the quiet anxiety before a miracle happens, and the sudden sense of wonder and relief when the miracle happens. This performative part makes sure that the emotional impact of each event stays the same, turning the audience into participants instead of just spectators. Through this immersive storytelling, hidden miracles come to life and become part of the collective memory. They change how people think about faith and divine intervention in everyday life. In some cultures, these hidden miracles teach moral and ethical lessons just as strongly as they show amazing events. In times of trouble, communities are reminded of the importance of faith, humility, and obedience. Many of the miracles that Elisha did, as told orally, are about choices, times when people had to have faith, trust guidance, or face their fears. These stories support the idea that divine power doesn't work on its own. Instead, miracles are connected to the bravery, judgment, and dedication of regular people. It is a viewpoint that gives each act of prophecy relational meaning, making the miraculous a part of the human experience. Another interesting thing about these Ethiopian oral traditions is that they keep stories of miracles that involve subtle spiritual help, protection that isn't seen, and guidance. There are stories of travelers who were saved from danger, of fights that were settled without violence, and of communities that were led through times of political unrest, all thanks to the prophet's unseen hand. These stories show how Ethiopians see God's presence as everywhere and active, directly dealing with the problems of human life. They also show that people in that culture value the hidden, the subtle, and the morally instructive. They remind people that not all miracles are big or dramatic. Some are quiet, personal, and deeply life-changing. Ethiopian monasteries and elders build a bridge between the spiritual and the human, the miraculous and the everyday by keeping these hidden stories alive. Elisha is not only a person of great power, but also a guide, a protector, and a touchstone for moral and community life. The stories show that miracles aren't just things that make people feel awe. They are real experiences that shape character, strengthen faith, and give communities practical advice on how to deal with problems like poverty, illness, and social issues. The effect is both immediate and long-lasting, a reminder that the prophet's heart is just as much a part of the miracle as the prophet himself. These oral traditions bring the lost miracles of Elisha to life in ways that the canonical texts can't. They show a prophet whose influence is very personal, whose actions affect both the normal and the extraordinary, and whose presence still has an effect on communities that are very religious. The Ethiopian perspective underscores that divine power is not remote or abstract, but is immediate, relational, and integral to the lived experiences of individuals it influences. In Ethiopian culture, prophets like Elisha healed people not just in ancient texts but also in the holy water rituals that are still used today and affect people all over the world. People often do these rituals in monastery courtyards, riverbanks, and sacred springs. They are a way for the faithful to feel a real connection to divine power. Picture this: rows of people praying next to a flowing spring, their eyes closed in anticipation, the air thick with incense, and the chants of monks creating a rhythm that seems to pull the spiritual into the physical. In this setting, the waters themselves become an extension of Elisha's miracles, a way for divine healing to get into people's bodies, minds, and hearts. There is a strong symbolic link between Elisha's biblical actions and the use of holy water in Ethiopian culture. Like the prophet who healed the sick and brought them back to life through prayer, touch, and divine command, these waters also help people spiritually renew themselves. People who believe dip their hands, faces, or whole bodies into the holy streams, thinking that the same divine energy that flowed through Elisha now flows through the water. The act is both physical and spiritual. It engages the body while opening the heart to faith, creating a layered experience where belief, hope, and expectation come together. It is not just a ritual, it is a living proof that God is still working in the world, where the miraculous becomes part of everyday life. The stories of how holy water can purify are very vivid. A sick child was brought to the spring at one monastery, and the air was filled with the prayers of the people who lived there. The ritual was done very carefully. The monks read psalms, the water was blessed with incense smoke, and the prophet's name was called out in a rhythmic way that built tension and anticipation. People who were there say that the child's breathing steadied, their cheeks got color back, and the mood of the group became calm. It was a moment full of emotion, like the suspense and release that Elisha's famous miracles have. Every healing became a story of faith that happened in real time, where the human and divine came together in a very real way. The communal aspect of these rituals is also very important. In Ethiopian culture, healing usually doesn't happen alone. Families, neighbors, and even whole villages take part. Their presence adds to the spiritual energy and strengthens social ties. When holy water is used to bless the sick, it is not just the person who benefits. The ritual becomes a way for everyone to feel hopeful and safe. People see change, feel their faith renewed, and feel a sense of unity that goes beyond normal social interaction. In this case, the miracle is both personal and communal, just like how Elisha's actions in the Bible affected not just individuals but whole communities, teaching lessons about compassion, obedience, and faith in God's care. One of the most interesting things about these healing practices is how they affect people's emotions. Monasteries often tell stories about the tension before the miracle, like the worry on people's faces, the quiet prayers whispered into the air, and the palpable anxiety as people wait for help. As the water touches skin or lips, the mood changes. People feel relief, joy, and gratitude, which is similar to the dramatic suspense of biblical stories. These rituals keep the cinematic quality of miracles alive by turning old actions into sensory experiences that everyone can enjoy. Faith becomes visible, almost real, when the emotional and spiritual parts of life come together. Holy water has a moral and spiritual meaning that goes beyond just healing the body. People think that it cleanses both the body and the soul, getting rid of fear, doubt, and spiritual pain. People see the waters as a way for God to show justice and mercy, a way for the faithful to face sin, weakness, or bad luck and come out stronger. In this way, the rituals show the Ethiopian view of prophecy as a whole. Healing is not just about getting rid of disease, but also about bringing harmony, balance, and spiritual alignment back to people and communities. Fear, hope, and gratitude are all parts of the miracle itself. This shows how faith is relational, which is a key part of Elisha's lasting legacy. These rituals also show how scripture and real life are connected. In villages all over Ethiopia, elders tell stories about how holy water brings about the same miracles that are written about in the Bible. The community sees these actions as extensions of Elisha's divine authority, whether they are restoring sight, healing fever, or easing chronic pain. People come from far away to take part in these ceremonies because they have heard stories of past miracles. By doing so, they become part of a story that blurs the line between historical prophecy and modern faith. The waters act as a living bridge between generations, between the biblical past and the present, and they show that divine intervention is not limited by time. Holy water rituals often deal with bigger problems in the community, not just healing individuals. When there is a drought, an epidemic, or social unrest, water is blessed and given out with prayers for everyone to feel better. The emotional effect is deep. Fear and doubt are met with hope and comfort. Despair is replaced by unity, and the whole community feels the presence of divine care. At these times, the ritual serves as both a spiritual practice and a way to keep society stable, strengthening faith in God and in each other. These practices show that Elisha's legacy goes beyond individual actions to shape social consciousness. They show that miracles are good for both individuals and groups. Even the smallest things that happen during these rituals are important. A gentle touch of holy water, a whispered prayer, or a shared dip in the spring can all make you feel very connected. People who watch often say they feel warm, clear, or calm, which are feelings that are very deep in the human mind. These subtle signs are like the relational and emotional parts of Elisha's miracles in the Bible. They show how faith and divine power work together with human receptivity. Every act of healing, no matter how simple, tells a story of involvement, trust, and change. This supports the idea that miracles are as much about people being involved as they are about divine action. Through these stories, holy water becomes more than just a symbol. It shows how Elisha's miracles keep happening, how deep communal faith can be, and how divine intervention can last forever. The waters connect the past and the present, the Bible and real life, individual pain and group hope. They remind people who believe that miracles are not far away or abstract, but are present in everyday things like the touch of water, the rhythm of prayer, and the trust that comes from being part of a faith-based community. Elisha's healing miracles continue to bring life to communities in this way, linking human weakness, divine presence, and the lasting power of faith. The stories of Elisha's miracles of resurrection have a power that few other acts can match in the quiet villages and ancient towns of biblical Israel, where life and death are in a delicate balance and human hope is on the edge of despair. One of the most moving stories is about the Shunammite woman's child, who got sick and died suddenly, leaving the parents in shock and deep grief. Picture the scene. The house is quiet except for the mother's quiet sobs. The room is still, heavy with loss, and the air is thick with the tension between despair and the faintest glimmer of faith. In these close moments, Elisha's interventions have the most impact because the miracle is not just a sign of God's power, it is also a deeply personal event that affects the hearts and minds of everyone involved. Elisha's method of resurrection is characterized by a blend of patience, ritual, and resolute determination. He doesn't hurry, he moves slowly and with purpose, paying attention to both the spiritual and human aspects of the moment. He stretches out over the body of the dead child when he enters the room. His hands are in a position that shows both authority and compassion. The tension is like a movie scene, with the child not moving, the mother holding her breath, and the people in the house frozen in a state of hope and disbelief. Every detail, from the prophet's focused prayers to the child's breathing changes, is part of a story that keeps the audience on the edge of their seats, making them feel the tension, the emotional strain, and the sudden release when life returns. In Ethiopian tradition, these stories have mystical and spiritual layers that go beyond the physical act. Resurrection is more than just bringing a body back to life. It is also a reaffirmation of God's power, a victory of faith over despair, and a reminder that life and the afterlife are connected in a spiritual way. Bringing the Shunammite child back to life is often seen as a symbolic link between the earthly and the divine. It shows that death is not the end of God's power. The mystical aspect adds to the emotional impact and makes people think about how faith, obedience, and divine grace work together when people don't understand things. The human reactions to the miracle make the story more tense. Witnesses are not just watching. Their doubt, anticipation, and eventual amazement are just as important to the story as the act itself. The mother's mix of sadness and cautious hope, the servants' worried looks, and the community's quiet prayers all add to the feeling of suspense in the air. These moments are full of dramatic beats in movie terms. The stillness before the miracle, the slow rise of hope, and the release of emotion and sight when life comes back. This way of telling a story makes people feel like they are part of the action instead of just watching it from afar. Elisha's miracles of resurrection frequently impart lessons that transcend the immediate event. They show the human side of faith, like being patient, humble, and brave enough to trust when things seem impossible. The Shunammite woman's faith and the prophet's obedience to divine guidance show how human actions and divine intervention can work together. The miracle is not forced on the community. It is made possible by belief, ritual, and being open to it. In this way, resurrection miracles are just as much about the living as they are about the dead. They teach resilience, build trust, and show how deeply relational faith is. Ethiopian interpretations of these miracles also stress how they affect people as a group and on an emotional level. People in monasteries and villages tell stories of resurrection to show how prayer can give people hope and moral strength. Elders often tell the story of the Shunammite child's revival in great detail, including the tension, grief, and awe that followed. These stories teach younger generations about patience and faith by showing how divine power can show itself through people working together and hoping for the best. The audience feels like they are in the room with the characters, going through suspense, relief, and emotional release as they listen to the story. The contrast between life and death, despair and hope makes resurrection miracles even more cinematic. The starkness of a child's dead body against the possibility of divine restoration makes for a strong visual and emotional contrast that works in any story. The prophet's calm in the middle of chaos, the quiet persistence of prayer, and the return of life all create a rhythm that is similar to classical dramatic storytelling. The first shock, the tense rituals, and the small signs of life all build up to a release that affects both the mind and the spirit. These miracles also make us think about how weak and dependent we are on God. In these stories, death is not just a physical event. It is a spiritual and emotional crisis that tests faith, faces grief, and pushes hope to its limits. Elisha's actions show that God's power interacts with our weakness, turning despair into new life. The Shunammite child serves as a focal point for examining the intricate relationship between mortality, faith, and community, underscoring that miracles are relational phenomena, experienced, remembered, and emotionally processed in unison. The stories of resurrection affect social and spiritual life even after the immediate revival. Families tell stories about miracles to give people hope, help them make moral decisions, and strengthen their faith as a group. The stories teach that life is about responsibility, obedience, and faith in relationships, which helps shape who we are. In Ethiopian culture, these miracles are still a part of everyday life. They inspire rituals, prayers, and meditation that keep the memory of divine intervention alive. Through these actions, Elisha's legacy continues to shape how people think about life, death, and the power of God that lasts forever. Resurrection miracles, as recounted in both biblical and Ethiopian narratives, are extraordinary not only for their supernatural elements but also for their profound human, emotional, and spiritual depth. They stimulate the imagination, elicit empathy, and generate suspense, while imparting timeless lessons regarding faith, trust, and the relational essence of divine action. People who watch these stories are drawn in by the delicate balance between death and hope, sadness and happiness, despair and the power of God's presence to change things. In these moments, Elisha is both a prophet and a guide, showing that miracles are just as much about people being involved as they are about God doing something. Elisha's miracles of multiplication were not just acts of divine power. They were also lessons in faith, generosity, and the importance of community in a world where lack could lead to hunger and desperation. Imagine a small village where the granaries are empty and the parents are nervously counting the last barley loaves. The children are worried and their eyes are wide. The prophet walks into this scene, calm but sure of himself. He only has a few jars, a few loaves of bread, or a small container of oil. What happens next is a change that is both social and emotional, as well as miraculous. A clear sign of how human need and divine provision come together. The Ethiopian tradition of the multiplication of oil is a miracle that happens over and over again and has both symbolic and practical meaning. A widow was about to lose everything because her debts were about to take over her family. It looks like her only resource, a small flask of oil, isn't enough. Elisha tells her to pour from that one vessel into many empty jars. The oil flows endlessly, filling each jar without stopping. This not only gives her food, but it also shows her faith in action in a powerful way. The miracle is very powerful because it shows a principle that goes beyond the physical. Divine provision works through human participation. The widow's willingness to follow the prophet and trust beyond reason opens the door to the miraculous. This shows that miracles in Ethiopian culture are relational and involve both human openness and divine intervention. In the same way, stories about feeding a lot of people show how scarcity, community, and faith all come together. Families in one village come together for a ritual blessing, their plates almost empty and the tension in the air. Elisha takes a small amount of barley and, in a miracle, gives it to dozens of people, with each portion growing to make sure that no one goes hungry. People are not only amazed by the abundance, but also by the social impact. The tension of scarcity goes away, and people feel joy, relief, and a renewed sense of community. The miracle shows that divine power isn't just for show. It works in everyday life to meet real human needs while also teaching moral and spiritual lessons about sharing, trust, and working together. The stories about these miracles are full of emotional details. In the Ethiopian oral tradition, elders talk about how people reacted to what they saw, like their eyes widening, gasps of surprise, and cautious disbelief that turns into tears of gratitude. Kids reach for loaves that seem to grow in size, and neighbors look at each other in disbelief as jars of oil spill over. Every reaction shows how deeply it affects people, making a movie-like tapestry where suspense, wonder, and relief are all mixed together. This way of telling the story makes the miracle feel both communal and very personal, as faith and necessity come together in ways that affect every part of human perception. Miracles of multiplication also have moral and spiritual meanings. Elisha's acts of provision often happen in situations where people are generous and obedient. These situations show that being faithful to God and caring about others can lead to divine blessings. Power alone does not change the widow's oil or the village barley. They are made stronger because they are given to people who are guided by faith. This relational dynamic is fundamental to Ethiopian interpretations. Miracles are not isolated occurrences but interactions between human agency and divine grace. They show a way of looking at the world in which food, wealth, and health are all shared experiences that highlight the social, moral, and spiritual aspects of daily life. These miracles not only have an immediate effect on people's bodies, but they also change the way people remember things over time. Villagers and monks tell stories of jars of oil that were full or loaves of bread that were multiplied for the hungry as examples of hope, faith, and God's faithfulness. They strengthen cultural and spiritual identity by reminding people that lack of resources doesn't mean lack of provision and that divine generosity often works through everyday things. In these stories, every act of faith, pouring oil, sharing bread, trusting divine guidance, becomes a part of a larger spiritual journey. This shows that miracles are less about show and more about how they change hearts and communities over time. Ethiopian culture often focuses on the dramatic and sensory aspects of these miracles. Witnesses have an immersive experience when they see oil pouring into jars, bread being passed out to anxious families in a rhythmic way, and the feeling of abundance that replaces want. Monks and storytellers use cadence, repetition, and gestures to make this effect stronger, so that listeners can feel the tension and relief as if they were there. These kinds of performances keep the miracle's emotional truth alive, showing that faith is something you do and feel, not just something you read or see. The miracles of food and oil also show how human creativity and divine intervention can work together. Elisha tells the faithful in many stories to arrange, pour, or give out what little they have. He stresses that human effort and faithfulness are important to the miracle happening. Abundance does not come from passively relying on the miraculous. It comes from actively participating. These actions teach us about being responsible, being grateful, and working together as a community. They also show us that God often works through people who are honest and work together. Even the smallest details of these miracles can teach us something. The careful counting of jars, the distribution of bread to make sure no one is left out, and the focus on order in both ritual and action all show moral and spiritual lessons that are built into the physical act. These stories help people in Ethiopian communities be more aware, empathetic, and aware that having a lot of things is something everyone can enjoy, not just a few. Faith becomes clear, moral values are strengthened, and the miraculous serves as a reflection of human behavior, showing that lessons from God are always relevant to how we live our lives. These miracles of multiplication make it very clear how faith, provision, and community are all connected. They show that divine intervention is most powerful when it happens in relationships, like between family members, neighbors, and people of different ages. The Ethiopian tradition that preserves Elisha's legacy shows that miracles are not just about making people feel awe, they are also about teaching, guiding, and supporting communities. The overflowing oil and multiplying loaves remind us that God's abundance is not random but purposeful, and it is closely linked to what people do, their responsibilities, and their moral alignment. Elisha's stories about spiritual battles are both scary and awe-inspiring in the middle of all the pain and suffering people are going through. The story of Naaman, the Syrian commander with leprosy, is not only about healing his body, it is also about facing the unseen forces that control human weakness. Imagine Naaman, a proud and powerful man, who is sick and weak, traveling through dangerous land with fear and doubt written all over his face. The trip to Elisha's house is full of tension, and the air is thick with anticipation as the commander faces both his own doubts and the unseen spiritual forces that seem to be working against his recovery. This is more than just a medical problem. It's a real encounter with evil that tests the limits of human faith and endurance. Elisha's answer to Naaman's problem seems simple, but it has a lot of spiritual meaning. He tells the commander to dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River. This seems almost anticlimactic to the human mind, but it's this simplicity that makes the miracle seem more mystical. Naaman's initial anger and disbelief exemplify a common human inclination to undervalue divine methodologies and to gauge God's power through earthly standards. In Ethiopian interpretations, this hesitation is the most important part of the story. It shows that true healing, whether physical or spiritual, needs humility, obedience, and an understanding of forces that are beyond human control. Dipping into the river becomes both a real and a symbolic act of immersion, washing away not just disease but also pride, resistance, and spiritual blindness. In these stories, leprosy is more than just a disease. It stands for being alone, weak, and having evil forces in your life. Ethiopian culture often sees these kinds of illnesses as signs of spiritual imbalance or evil influence. This means that the prophet's intervention is a fight against forces that are both invisible and very real. The tension in the movie is real. The sick man, standing on the riverbank, is unsure and ashamed, while Elisha, who is calm and in charge, represents divine oversight. The miracle happens slowly, letting the audience feel the suspense, the danger, and the eventual release of Naaman's restored health. This is like the victory of order over chaos, good over evil, and faith over fear. The story has layers of spiritual warfare that go beyond the healing itself. Evil forces, according to Ethiopians, are not just ideas. They affect people's lives by causing sickness, bad luck, and moral weakness. Prophets like Elisha act as middlemen, bringing God's power to bear on these influences. In Naaman's case, the leprosy is a sign of invisible forces at work. Healing is as much about fighting those forces as it is about restoring flesh. The drama is cinematic. The river, the hesitant plunge, the transformative immersion, and the sudden revelation of restored health all show how divine power struggles against and ultimately wins over evil. The communal aspect of these spiritual conflicts is equally captivating. In Ethiopian culture, seeing a miracle has a collective impact. Families, neighbors, and communities all see and process the event, feeling both relief and awe. When Naaman comes out of the river completely healed, the people around him see not only the physical healing but also the proof of God's power over evil forces. This shared witnessing strengthens cultural and spiritual identity by teaching that faith is relational, that divine power works both personally and in groups, and that the fight against evil is an ongoing story in which people must take part through prayer, obedience, and moral alignment. Ethiopian interpretations say that demonic influence and spiritual opposition are often linked to everyday problems. Illness, conflict, and misfortune are not arbitrary events. They stem from forces that can be opposed, mitigated, or remedied through divine intervention. So, Elisha is not only a healer, he is also a spiritual warrior who moves through the places where evil shows up in real life. You can picture the tension in these scenes, the visible signs of pain, the subtle but real presence of unseen forces, and the prophet's calm focus as he carries out God's will. Every action, every order, and every immersion is a part of the cosmic struggle. This makes the miracle both a story of hope and a visual display of spiritual power. These stories also show how human feelings and spiritual experiences can affect each other. Naaman's pride, doubt, and eventual humility are key parts of the story. They show that spiritual battles are never just outside of us. You have to deal with internal resistance, doubt, and fear as well as physical and social problems. Ethiopian stories often show this inner struggle in a dramatic way, showing how following God's orders, trusting others, and being in line with them are all necessary for success. The audience goes on this journey with the characters, feeling the stress of not knowing what will happen, the fear of the heart, and the freedom that comes with giving in to divine authority. These kinds of miracles have effects that go beyond the person who experienced them. Healing leprosy or freeing someone from spiritual oppression brings people back together, brings back people who have been pushed to the edges, and strengthens the faith of the whole community. In Naaman's tale, the healed commander comes back to his home and community not only physically better but also morally and spiritually better. People who see miracles are reminded that they affect not only individual fate but also the lives of everyone. Consequently, spiritual battles are not individual conflicts but collective narratives wherein the repercussions of faith, obedience, and divine intervention reverberate throughout households and villages. Even the smallest parts of these meetings, like the whispered prayers, the prophet's hand on the person, and the immersion in holy water, have meaning. They show the connection between the normal and the extraordinary, as well as between human weakness and divine watchfulness. Ethiopian tradition teaches that such gestures are open to everyone. It also teaches that the faithful are never powerless and that prayer, ritual, or moral action can change the course of ongoing spiritual conflicts. These stories show that evil is always there, but working with divine authority is an important part of getting rid of it. These stories bring Elisha's battles against evil to life in a cinematic way. The tension between affliction and restoration, the confrontation of unseen forces, and the dramatic revelation of divine victory make scenes that are both emotionally powerful and spiritually enlightening. People who watch see the fragility of humans, the strength of community faith, and the unchanging presence of divine authority. These themes are all woven together in stories that are full of suspense, moral lessons, and emotional depth. In this way, the miracles that happen to people with leprosy and spiritual oppression are more than just stories from the past. They are living stories that still shape how people think, act, and believe in the ongoing fight between good and evil. In Ethiopian tradition, Elisha is seen as a prophet whose power and wisdom go beyond normal limits. He lives in places where the mystical and the historical meet. These stories, which are often found in old manuscripts and told by monks in monasteries, show Elisha as both a person and a being from another world. People in the village talk about him with both respect and awe, telling stories of times when he showed up in dreams or visions and guided, comforted, or intervened in ways that are hard to understand. The stories are like movies: a lone figure on a faraway hill, a strange light breaking through the darkness, and the quiet voices of witnesses shaking with the weight of meeting God. One of these mystical stories is about a place that was suffering from a drought, where fields were bare and streams were dry. People in whole communities were about to give up because they couldn't support themselves in normal ways. People called on Elisha's name, and through a mix of ritual, prayer, and his spiritual presence, the clouds came together, the rivers rose, and the crops grew. What is remarkable in these accounts is not just the physical change, but also how the people felt it: the relief, the surprise, and the strengthening of their faith as a group. Children danced in the rain, older people cried tears of joy, and even people who didn't believe were quieted by the clear display of divine power. These reactions are important in Ethiopian traditions because they show that miracles are real events that affect people's emotions, challenge their expectations, and strengthen the community's moral and spiritual framework. A lot of these hidden miracles have to do with spirits, visions, and cosmic signs that show God's will. Elisha frequently encounters these phenomena during his travels, positioning him at the juncture of the terrestrial and the mystical. One manuscript says that he walked through a village at night, where most people couldn't see him but those who were spiritually aware could. He heals the sick, protects the weak, and gives people wisdom through brief visits, leaving them with a sense of wonder that lasts long after he leaves. The story conveys the suspense of not knowing what's going to happen and the deep awe of divine revelation, drawing the audience into a world where everyday life and spiritual truth meet. The effects of these mystical events depend a lot on how people react to them. Witnesses frequently articulate a blend of fear and hope, skepticism yielding to awe, and the mundane progression of daily existence abruptly interrupted by extraordinary events. Ethiopian storytellers stress these emotional layers, making the point that miracles are not just things to see, but things to feel. When a farmer sees his barren land flourish, a mother sees her child recover inexplicably, or a village community is protected from disaster, these are all examples of how divine interaction changes how we see things. The audience, whether they are in the story or listening to it being read, is invited to feel these feelings, which brings the human and the divine together. The mystical stories often mix up time and space, which makes it seem like Elisha's power isn't limited to one time or place. There are stories that his advice has traveled to faraway places, shown up in dreams, or inspired prophetic insight in future generations. This fluidity of time makes his story more epic, putting Elisha in a position where his presence and power go beyond the limits of linear history. In Ethiopian manuscripts, he is sometimes shown as an unseen hand moving silently among people and changing things, or as a spiritual companion who helps people make decisions that will affect the moral and practical life of communities. These kinds of pictures turn him from a historical prophet into a lasting symbol of divine guidance. His actions connect human experience with spiritual continuity. Mystical miracles are also very connected to lessons about right and wrong. Elisha is often shown rewarding humility, faith, and honesty while punishing pride, selfishness, or disbelief. The miraculous is often used as a story element to teach people about being brave, following rules, and paying attention to their spiritual lives. When a sick child gets better, when a famine ends, or when danger is avoided, the focus is not just on the amazing event, but also on the human actions that bring about or align with divine intervention. Ethiopian traditions stress that miracles are relational, meaning that people must recognize the presence of God, trust spiritual guidance, and take part in the community. These stories help people understand that faith isn't something you just believe in. It's something you live, experience, and prove through your interactions with the sacred. The film aspect of these stories is very important. Writers and oral storytellers use the sensory and emotional landscape to build suspense, tension, and resolution. The flicker of torchlight on manuscripts, the rustle of trees in remote villages, or the silence before a miraculous event carry as much weight in the story as the miracle itself. The gasp of surprise, the tear of relief, and the whispered prayers are all examples of human reactions that give the story a rhythm and make it feel real to the listeners. In this way, mystical stories serve as both spiritual lessons and movie stories, stimulating the imagination while strengthening moral and community identity. The preservation of these hidden miracles in Ethiopian manuscripts and oral traditions shows how important memory, storytelling, and passing on sacred knowledge are. Elders and monks are responsible for keeping the lessons of faith, courage, and divine intervention alive for future generations. Each retelling has small differences that show how the community has lived and how history, spirituality, and human emotion all work together in a dynamic way. People who listen are reminded that the miraculous is not far away or abstract. It is woven into the fabric of everyday life and is ready to change, inspire, and intervene in those who are open to it. Even the smallest mystical signs, like an unexplained shadow, a sudden feeling of peace, or a whispered message, are important. They remind us that God is always with us and that miracles don't always have to be big, loud events. They can also be small, quiet, and very personal. Ethiopian tradition stresses that you need to be aware, humble, and willing to connect with the world spiritually in order to see and respond to these signs. In these stories, Elisha is the person through whom ordinary people come into contact with extraordinary divine reality. This shows that the mystical and the everyday are always connected. These legends outside of the Bible make Elisha's life and work seem epic, awe-inspiring, and very human. The hidden miracles that are kept in manuscripts and told in stories make a rich tapestry of divine interaction, emotional resonance, and moral teaching. They show that faith is about relationships, that miracles change things, and that the human response, wonder, reverence, and ethical action is an important part of the sacred story. These mystical stories about Elisha's life make sure that his legacy continues to inspire, challenge, and involve people in Ethiopia, connecting the past, the present, and the spiritual. When one looks at Elisha's life and miracles through the lens of Ethiopian tradition, a question comes to mind. Why were so many of these stories left out of the Western Bible? The reasons are as complicated and multifaceted as the historical, political, and religious contexts that influenced early Christianity. During the early years of canonization, some texts were given more importance than others. This was often because of political or theological reasons. Miracles that focused on local customs, mystical experiences, or different ways of looking at prophecy were often pushed to the side. The powerful rulers and church leaders of the time had a vested interest in making a single story that supported their religious authority, and any stories that didn't fit their vision were either left out or downplayed. This selective preservation inevitably resulted in the loss of numerous extraordinary acts performed by Elisha, particularly those that contested traditional notions of power, divine intervention, and human agency. Ethiopian Christianity, on the other hand, kept a wider range of sacred knowledge, partly because of where it was located and what culture it was part of. Ethiopian communities, cut off from the main centers of religious authority in Europe and the Near East, kept manuscripts, oral traditions, and monastic teachings that told a more complete and detailed story of prophetic activity. These accounts not only documented Elisha's canonical miracles, but also exalted the mystical, relational, and communal aspects of his ministry. They record his actions in ways that show how they fit in with local customs, the environment, and social dynamics. This gives a view that is relevant to both the spiritual elite and everyday people. Ethiopian tradition offers a unique insight into the perception of divine intervention beyond the limitations of Western orthodoxy by safeguarding these narratives. The shifting of political power had a small but important effect on the marginalization of some texts. In the early centuries, the consolidation of religious authority was closely linked to imperial influence, and texts that opposed the centralization of doctrinal control faced the threat of suppression. Miracles that highlighted the prophet's independent spiritual authority or illustrated God's power operating through local communities rather than centralized hierarchies were frequently regarded as contentious. The narratives of Elisha, particularly those highlighting communal sustenance, spiritual enlightenment, and mystical experiences, frequently conflicted with the developing frameworks of ecclesiastical authority. Their exclusion signifies not merely theological dissent but also illustrates the convergence of faith, politics, and human aspiration. Religious interpretations were also very important in deciding what was canonical. Western authorities frequently preferred narratives that supported linear historical frameworks, anticipated moral lessons, and hierarchical interpretations of divine authority. The Ethiopian texts, on the other hand, have a more flexible view of time, cause and effect, and spiritual interaction. Miracles that happen outside of expected patterns, involve visions, or go against what people expect were kept in Ethiopia because they were seen as real signs of God's presence. This difference in theological priorities is why many of Elisha's most impressive miracles, especially those that involved mystical encounters, multiplication, or community-centered interventions, were not well known in the West for hundreds of years. The cultural context is just as important. Ethiopian Christianity emerged in a society that esteemed both oral tradition and manuscript preservation. Elders, monks, and community leaders made sure that stories were not only written down but also acted out, told again, and made into rituals. These practices made the miraculous a part of everyday life, turning the stories into real-life experiences instead of just abstract scripture. The Western canon, on the other hand, often put written records in certain languages and places above oral tradition. This difference helps explain why the content is different. Western texts were simplified, codified, and made more uniform, while Ethiopian tradition kept the richness of human experience, communal memory, and mystical interpretation. Economic and environmental factors also played a role in what was kept. Ethiopian monasteries were places where people learned and made manuscripts. They were often supported by communities that valued local spiritual insight. Scribes carefully copied texts that might have been lost in other places, protecting the shared memory of miracles, spiritual practices, and prophetic wisdom. It wasn't by chance that these documents survived. It was a deliberate choice by communities to value, protect, and pass on knowledge that Western power centers might have thought was unimportant or unimportant. Each manuscript and each story told is a sign of resilience, the refusal to let the spiritual richness of prophetic activity fade away in the face of dominant narratives. The loss of Elisha's miracles in the Western Bible is not a historical mistake. It is a result of selective memory influenced by authority, geography, and interpretation. Ethiopian tradition, on the other hand, corrects this by showing parts of the prophet's life that were hidden, forgotten, or thought to be too mystical or local to be included in other works. This makes people want to ask more questions, like what other stories have been kept secret or pushed to the side? What aspects of faith, community, and divine interaction have been neglected in predominant narratives? The mystery of the missing miracles becomes a call for curiosity, critical thinking, and looking at things from different points of view to learn more about both history and spirituality. People's reactions to this information are complex. For many, learning that there are deep miracles outside of the canonical texts makes them feel awe, doubt, and think. Some people may wonder why they were never told these stories, while others may feel validated by seeing their local or cultural traditions recognized as real ways to learn about God's truth. This revelation has the same emotional impact as the original miracles, which were full of suspense and awe. It tests faith, broadens understanding, and creates a new sense of connection with the prophetic tradition. Ethiopian manuscripts do more than just keep history alive. They also bring people together to talk about how people see things, how God acts, and how spiritual insight works. These lost miracles also have a lot of potential for movies. Imagine a monastery in the misty mountains where monks are reading old scrolls. The candlelight shows stories of a prophet doing miracles that no one else can see. Picture villagers telling these stories around fires, with kids leaning in and wide-eyed with wonder. Elders weave lessons of faith, bravery, and divine intervention into every story. Every story and every miracle pulls people in and makes them feel like they are part of a history that is both real and timeless. The loss of Elisha's miracles changes from being absent to being an invitation for modern audiences to seek, question, and interact with the rich spiritual history that is still alive in Ethiopia. By looking at the historical, political, and religious forces that shape the canon, one can start to understand why it is so important to protect Ethiopian culture. These traditions preserve not only the miraculous occurrences but also the emotional, ethical, and communal aspects that ensure the stories endure through time. People should not just see these stories as interesting, but as living proof that challenges their beliefs, strengthens their faith, and helps them understand more. The fact that these miracles were lost in one context and preserved in another shows how fragile and strong spiritual memory is. It also shows how important humans are in both hiding and protecting divine revelation. When you look at Elisha's life and miracles through the lens of Ethiopian tradition, a question comes to mind. Why were so many of these stories left out of the Western Bible? The reasons are as complicated and layered as the historical, political, and religious contexts that shaped early Christianity. During the early years of canonization, some texts were given more importance than others. This was often because of political or theological reasons. Miracles that focused on local customs, mystical experiences, or different ways of looking at prophecy were often pushed to the side. The powerful rulers and church leaders of the time had a vested interest in making a single story that supported their religious authority, and any stories that didn't fit their vision were either left out or downplayed. This selective preservation inevitably resulted in the loss of numerous extraordinary acts performed by Elisha, particularly those that contested traditional notions of power, divine intervention, and human agency. Ethiopian Christianity, on the other hand, kept a wider range of sacred knowledge, partly because of where it was located and what culture it was part of. Ethiopian communities, cut off from the main centers of religious authority in Europe and the Near East, kept manuscripts, oral traditions, and monastic teachings that told a more complete and detailed story of prophetic activity. These accounts not only documented Elisha's canonical miracles but also exalted the mystical, relational, and communal aspects of his ministry. They record his actions in ways that show how they fit in with local customs, the environment, and social dynamics. This gives a view that is relevant to both the spiritual elite and everyday people. Ethiopian tradition offers a unique insight into the perception of divine intervention beyond the limitations of Western orthodoxy by safeguarding these narratives. The shifting of political power had a small but important effect on the marginalization of some texts. In the early centuries, the consolidation of religious authority was closely linked to imperial influence, and texts that opposed the centralization of doctrinal control faced the threat of suppression. Miracles that highlighted the prophet's independent spiritual authority or illustrated God's power operating through local communities rather than centralized hierarchies were frequently regarded as contentious. The narratives of Elisha, particularly those highlighting communal sustenance, spiritual enlightenment, and mystical experiences, frequently conflicted with the developing frameworks of ecclesiastical authority. Their exclusion signifies not merely theological dissent but also illustrates the convergence of faith, politics, and human aspiration. Religious interpretations were also very important in deciding what was canonical. Western authorities frequently preferred narratives that supported linear historical frameworks, anticipated moral lessons, and hierarchical interpretations of divine authority. The Ethiopian texts, on the other hand, have a more flexible view of time, cause and effect, and spiritual interaction. Miracles that happen outside of expected patterns, involve visions, or go against what people expect were kept in Ethiopia because they were seen as real signs of God's presence. This difference in theological priorities is why many of Elisha's most impressive miracles, especially those that involved mystical encounters, multiplication, or community-centered interventions, were not well known in the West for hundreds of years. The cultural context is just as important. Ethiopian Christianity emerged in a society that esteemed both oral tradition and manuscript preservation. Elders, monks, and community leaders made sure that stories were not only written down but also acted out, told again, and made into rituals. These practices made the miraculous a part of everyday life, turning the stories into real-life experiences instead of just abstract scripture. The Western canon, on the other hand, often put written records in certain languages and places above oral tradition. This difference helps explain why the content is different. Western texts were simplified, codified, and made more uniform, while Ethiopian tradition kept the richness of human experience, communal memory, and mystical interpretation. Economic and environmental factors also played a role in what was kept. Ethiopian monasteries were places where people learned and made manuscripts. They were often supported by communities that valued local spiritual insight. Scribes carefully copied texts that might have been lost in other places, protecting the shared memory of miracles, spiritual practices, and prophetic wisdom. It wasn't by chance that these documents survived. It was a deliberate choice by communities to value, protect, and pass on knowledge that Western power centers might have thought was unimportant or unimportant. Each manuscript and each story told is a sign of resilience, the refusal to let the spiritual richness of prophetic activity fade away in the face of dominant narratives. The loss of Elisha's miracles in the Western Bible is not a historical mistake. It is a result of selective memory influenced by authority, geography, and interpretation. Ethiopian tradition, on the other hand, corrects this by showing parts of the prophet's life that were hidden, forgotten, or thought to be too mystical or local to be included in other works. This makes people want to ask more questions, like what other stories have been kept secret or pushed to the side? What aspects of faith, community, and divine interaction have been neglected in predominant narratives? The mystery of the missing miracles becomes a call for curiosity, critical thinking, and looking at things from different points of view to learn more about both history and spirituality. People's reactions to this information are complex. For many, learning that there are deep miracles outside of the canonical texts makes them feel awe, doubt, and think. Some people may wonder why they were never told these stories, while others may feel validated by seeing their local or cultural traditions recognized as real ways to learn about God's truth. This revelation has the same emotional impact as the original miracles, which were full of suspense and awe. It tests faith, broadens understanding, and creates a new sense of connection with the prophetic tradition. Ethiopian manuscripts do more than just keep history alive. They also bring people together to talk about how people see things, how God acts, and how spiritual insight works. These lost miracles also have a lot of potential for movies. Imagine a monastery in the misty mountains where monks are reading old scrolls. The candlelight shows stories of a prophet doing miracles that no one else can see. Picture villagers telling these stories around fires, with kids leaning in and wide-eyed with wonder. Elders weave lessons of faith, bravery, and divine intervention into every story. Every story and every miracle pulls people in and makes them feel like they are part of a history that is both real and timeless. The loss of Elisha's miracles changes from being absent to being an invitation for modern audiences to seek, question, and interact with the rich spiritual history that is still alive in Ethiopia. By looking at the historical, political, and religious forces that shape the canon, one can start to understand why it is so important to protect Ethiopian culture. These traditions preserve not only the miraculous occurrences but also the emotional, ethical, and communal aspects that ensure the stories endure through time. People are encouraged to not only see these stories as interesting, but also as living proof that they can change their beliefs, deepen their faith, and broaden their understanding. The fact that these miracles were lost in one context and saved in another shows how fragile and strong spiritual memory can be, and how important humans are in both hiding and protecting divine revelation. Elisha's miracles have had an impact on people today, especially in Ethiopian communities where the church still honors these sacred traditions. His healing, provision, and spiritual guidance are not just stories from the past. They are lessons that people today can learn from as they deal with their own problems. When you think about the story of Naaman's leprosy, for example, the focus is not just on getting better physically, but also on being humble, obedient, and trusting in things that are bigger than you. In modern life, these lessons serve as moral and spiritual guidance, reminding people that healing of the body, mind, or spirit often necessitates patience, faith, and adherence to elevated principles. People still look to these stories for inspiration, seeing them as examples of how to face hard times with bravery and moral integrity. Many Ethiopian towns and villages have stories about Elisha's miracles that are part of everyday life. Priests' holy water rituals, prayers for healing, and blessings are like the prophet's actions, showing that the past and present are connected. People bring their sick, tired, and worried loved ones to church, hoping to feel the same divine care and miraculous healing that Elisha experienced. The rituals are very meaningful and connect people to hundreds of years of spiritual tradition. They also give people real experiences of hope and comfort. When you see a group of people coming together in anticipation, with whispered prayers, candlelight flickering against old walls, and shared expressions of faith, you can feel the same awe and respect that people felt when the prophet acted. The lessons in these moments are clear. Faith is active, shared, and life-changing. Elisha's miracles also have a lot of cultural meaning. They strengthen social ties by emphasizing moral behavior and shared responsibility. When a miracle happens, it is not just one person who sees it. The whole community sees it, takes part in it, and thinks about what it means for their morals. Acts of kindness, healing, and protection serve as models for civic and moral involvement, instructing contemporary believers on the significance of empathy, service, and stewardship. Food multiplication stories, for example, are not just about getting food. They are also about sharing, taking care of others, and doing the right thing. These stories are a counterpoint to the trend of focusing on individual success. They show that community, faith, and living an ethical life are still important for people to thrive. The spiritual lessons are just as interesting. Miracles require more than just watching. They require participation, belief, and judgment. Faith is depicted as a potent force that can influence results when combined with persistence and moral conduct. The Ethiopian Church stresses that these lessons are not just old stories, but useful tools for dealing with the unknowns of life today. People in the parish are reminded that problems, sickness, and other difficulties are not just bad things that happen. They are chances to show trust, humility, and moral judgment. Elisha's story shows that human effort and divine guidance work together, each making the other stronger. The prophet's miracles are like lessons that keep going, connecting spiritual understanding with everyday life. The stories also show how personal change and social change are linked. When one person heals, it often has a positive effect on the whole community by strengthening social ties, inspiring group faith, and showing how to act morally. People who believe in God today are encouraged to think of their actions as part of a larger moral ecosystem rather than as separate events. This focus on relational responsibility, which comes from stories that are hundreds of years old, is very relevant today, when communities often face problems of social disconnection and moral ambiguity. The miracles of Elisha, which are still told in Ethiopia, give us both spiritual and practical ways to make places where care, justice, and faith are all connected. The story of Elisha's miracles is especially helpful in teaching about perseverance. Each action required steadfastness, whether it was Naaman's patience, the villagers' determination to get help, or the prophet's unwavering dedication to following God's commands. In today's world, this means teaching people about being strong, having strong morals, and sticking to their principles. Life is full of problems that can be just as hard and scary as those faced by biblical characters. The stories of Elisha show how faith, determination, and following higher principles can lead to big changes. Ethiopian churches often use these lessons in sermons, teaching, and community service to make sure that the prophet's legacy continues to shape how people today think about moral and spiritual responsibility. Educational practices also help keep cultural traditions alive. Kids learn about Elisha not just by reading, but also by listening to stories, taking part in rituals, and going to community events. These traditions teach kids to be humble, brave, and morally responsible from a young age. They also create a cultural memory that connects generations. Miracle stories become real-life lessons in morality, faith, and getting along with others, making sure that Elisha's moral and spiritual life stays strong and important. So, modern believers are not only learning about the past, but they are also taking part in a living tradition that shapes behavior, builds community identity, and encourages people to connect with God in their everyday lives. The emotional impact of these traditions is impossible to overstate. Seeing or hearing about miracles fills people with awe, hope, and inspiration, which affects both their hearts and minds. In modern times, the stories help people who are sick, sad, or going through a tough time by showing them how God cares for them and giving them hope and purpose. The emotional effect strengthens the lessons of faith, patience, and doing the right thing, turning Elisha's teachings from abstract ideas into real-life experiences. Ethiopian rituals and practices keep this emotional connection alive by making places where spiritual lessons are felt deeply, not just understood. Lastly, these stories make us think about how spiritual principles apply to everyone. The moral, ethical, and spiritual lessons of Elisha are based on Ethiopian culture, but they apply to people from all over the world and throughout history. Values like healing, generosity, perseverance, and obedience go beyond any one situation and can help anyone who is looking for meaning, purpose, and a moral compass. By honoring these traditions, the Ethiopian Church makes sure that the lesson's power to change lives stays strong. This shows that miracles from the past still have something to say to people today. Communities are reminded that the sacred is not limited to the past. It flows through time, providing guidance, inspiration, and moral clarity in every age. Picture yourself standing at the edge of an Ethiopian valley bathed in sunlight, with the soft sound of a river in the distance. Suddenly, you feel the presence of a prophet whose footsteps once walked these lands hundreds of years ago. This moment brings the stories of Elisha to life through manuscripts, oral tradition, and the memories of groups of people. His miracles, healing the sick, multiplying food, raising the dead, are not just things that happened a long time ago. They happen again in the mind, vividly and powerfully, showing how faith, human perseverance, and divine intervention come together. When you picture these events today, you can almost hear the whispers of awe and the gasps of surprise as villagers see water turn sweet, oil flow freely, and children come back to life. The cinematic canvas is huge, from golden fields glowing in the afternoon sun to candlelit monasteries where monks chant old prayers. Each frame is full of feeling, meaning, and spiritual resonance. The emotional impact of these stories comes from how they relate to people. Every miracle and divine act affects people and communities in different ways, making them feel wonder, gratitude, fear, and hope. A mother watching her sick child get better, a whole village being amazed by God's provision during a famine, or a lone traveler getting help through dreams, these are all personal ways that people respond to God's presence. Not only does the Ethiopian tradition focus on the event itself, but it also focuses on the effects it has on families, faith, and communities that are brought together by shared awe and respect. The movie version of the story brings these human experiences to the forefront, letting viewers feel the tension, relief, and excitement as if they were there to see the miracle. When we think about Elisha's miracles today, we see how the way light, shadow, and movement work together makes us feel more connected. Golden sunlight spilling over hills, water sparkling in sacred streams, and prayerful crowds swaying gently all create a visual language that conveys all without words. The prophet's image, whether seen in dreams, visions, or group rituals, stands for hope and continuity, reminding people that God's power goes beyond time. Each miracle, brought to life by the imagination of filmmakers, connects old events to our current understanding, making history real, tangible, and deeply moving. The end also makes people think about how faith relates to their own lives. Elisha's miracles are like mirrors that show people how moral courage, humility, and perseverance can change not just one person's life, but the lives of everyone in a community. The prophet's actions show that God often works through regular people, making moral choices, acts of kindness, and spiritual awareness stronger. As people watch these miracles happen on screen, they are encouraged to think about their own lives. When have they seen acts of grace, courage, or unexpected help? How can the teachings of faith, patience, and moral behavior affect choices made today? This reflective layer makes sure that watching a movie isn't just fun. It's also a chance to think about your morals and spirituality. These stories also have a feeling of continuity and timelessness. The miracles are not stuck in the past. They are still remembered by people today, connecting the ancient world to modern communities that still follow these traditions. Monks in Ethiopia still chant prayers for healing, local leaders lead villagers in rituals that ask for divine help, and families tell stories of miraculous events that changed their ancestors' lives. The movie's ending shows this continuity by combining historical, mystical, and modern elements into a beautiful and emotionally powerful tapestry. Each scene makes it clear that faith is not static, that miracles are not relics, and that the human response, wonder, devotion, and ethical action remains central across time. Cinematic storytelling lets you focus on the miracle's sensory and emotional aspects in a dramatic way. The sound of running water, the glow of oil in dark homes, the laughter of kids, and the tearful relief of the sick are all examples of details that make experiences that draw people in on many levels. The visual story shows how divine acts can change everyday life, like turning barren fields into flourishing ones, feeding poor communities, and turning sadness into joy. Each miracle serves as a lens for viewers to comprehend the potency of faith and the significant influence of human actions directed by divine principles. The movie's use of light, motion, sound, and pacing lets the audience fully experience the story, feeling the tension, the rush of hope, and the release of awe. The end also lets people talk about their feelings. It tells stories about miracles and asks people to think about what these events mean for their own lives and communities. Faith is depicted as concrete, relational, and actionable rather than abstract or remote. The movie version focuses on empathy, moral choice, and community responsibility, making viewers think about how their own acts of kindness, perseverance, and bravery can have an impact on others. This way, the documentary connects history and personal experience, turning far-off miracles into examples of how to be more ethical and spiritual in today's world. There is a strong sense of wonder and curiosity throughout the movie. The hidden miracles in Ethiopian tradition make people think about what other stories have been lost, forgotten, or ignored. How might acts of faith, bravery, and divine guidance that are not seen continue to affect people's lives today? This engagement with mystery not only heightens emotional resonance but also cultivates intellectual and spiritual curiosity, encouraging audiences to investigate the broader implications of prophetic narratives and their enduring significance. Finally, the journey through pictures and feelings ends with a feeling of awe and continuity. The audience is left with images that stay with them: valleys bathed in sunlight, rivers flowing with healing waters, communities praying together, and the silent presence of a prophet whose actions changed history and still inspire. The movie's ending reminds us that miracles are both historical and eternal, that how people respond to God is important, and that the lessons of faith, perseverance, and moral courage are still important today as they were hundreds of years ago. As the screen fades to the soft sound of chanting or the shine of sunlight on holy water, one feels both the weight of history and the immediacy of spiritual presence. The journey ends with curiosity, reflection, and a sense of connection to the sacred traditions that have been passed down through Ethiopian Christianity. We want to take a moment to connect with you, our viewers, as we bring this amazing journey to an end. You are not just watching a video, you are part of a community that values faith, history, and learning about deep spiritual truths. It means the world to us that you support us. It is what lets us keep finding and sharing these hidden stories from the Ethiopian prophetic traditions. Please subscribe to our channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with your friends if you like this trip through Elisha's life and miracles. Every click, share, and subscription helps us grow and reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers. This lets us keep making more in-depth and meaningful content that brings ancient wisdom to life. We also ask that you help us out financially through super thanks. Your donations directly help us dig deeper, find rare manuscripts, and learn more about the less well-known parts of history and faith. Every donation helps us go further, bringing more amazing stories to your screens and helping to keep knowledge that has been lost for hundreds of years. When you support us, you're not just helping a channel, you're also joining the mission to find and share truths that inspire, teach, and change lives. We want everyone to be able to watch this video together. Please leave a comment below with your name and the city where you are watching. This one simple act creates a worldwide community of viewers who are connected not only by their interest in the miraculous, but also by their curiosity, faith, and desire to learn more about the Ethiopian Bible's rich history. Seeing your name next to your city gives us and others hope, reminding everyone that these stories are happening right now, all over the world, in real lives. Lastly, we've included links to the full 88 books of the Ethiopian Bible and the Book of Enoch in English for those who want to learn more. These texts have a lot of information, mystical stories, and prophetic traditions that we couldn't cover in one documentary. You can connect with history, spirituality, and faith in a very personal way by owning and reading them. By reading these books, you continue your journey of learning, finding hidden wisdom, and realizing how much prophetic figures like Elisha have changed the world. If you subscribe, share, comment, or support us through super thanks, you help make sure that these stories get to the people who need them most. We are all working together to create a community that values faith, history, and the power of knowledge to change lives. Thank you for being a part of this journey, for helping us find these lost miracles, and for making sure that Elisha's legacy lives on for many years to come. What if the miracles you thought you knew about were only part of the story? What if there were hidden acts of divine power, performed by a prophet whose life shaped entire communities, yet were never recorded in the Western Bible? Imagine a world where every miracle, every act of healing, and every moment of divine intervention carried a story so profound it could change the way we see faith, history, and human courage. This is the world of Elisha, a prophet whose name echoes through Scripture, yet whose full legacy has been preserved in a place many never expect: Ethiopia. Here, in the sacred halls of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, his life and works are remembered not only for the well-known miracles of the canonical